It was a quiet evening in the heart of the city, the kind of night that made people lower their guard. The air was crisp, carrying the faint aroma of nearby food trucks and the distant hum of traffic. Monica Carter, a striking woman in her early 30s, walked confidently down the dimly lit street, her steps steady, her presence commanding. She wasn't just anyone. Monica was an FBI tactical expert, trained to face the most dangerous situations imaginable. But tonight, she wasn't in her tactical gear or carrying a badge. Tonight, she was just another person on her way home, blending into the crowd. Or so it seemed. Monica had grown up understanding that the world wasn't always fair. As a black woman, she had faced her share of challenges, but she had never allowed them to define her. Instead, they fueled her drive to succeed, to excel, to become someone who could make a real difference. And she had done just that. Her expertise in negotiation and self-defense was unmatched. Her name respected in circles that few ever entered. But none of that was apparent to anyone who might cross her path on a night like this. The streetlights cast long shadows as Monica turned down a quieter street, a shortcut she had taken countless times. She noticed the faint sound of footsteps behind her, several of them. At first, she paid little mind. Living in the city meant constant noise, and people were always coming and going. But the rhythm of those steps was different, deliberate, too synchronized to be a coincidence. Her instincts kicked in. She didn't turn her head, didn't break her stride, but every fiber of her being went on high alert. Her training had taught her to assess threats quickly, and though she wasn't in uniform tonight, she was far from defenseless. She discreetly scanned her surroundings. A group of 5 men had fanned out behind her, their voices low, but their intentions unmistakable. They weren't there by chance. "Hey, lady," one of them called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Where you think you're going in such a hurry?" Monica didn't respond. She had learned long ago that engaging too early could escalate things unnecessarily. Instead, she maintained her pace, her mind calculating the best way to handle the situation. She could feel their presence closing in, their confidence growing as they sensed what they thought was fear. But Monica wasn't afraid. She was ready. The men began to surround her, their postures aggressive, their taunts becoming louder. "What's wrong?" "Too good to talk to us." Another sneered, stepping into her path. Monica stopped, her eyes locking onto his with a calm intensity that momentarily threw him off balance. She could see it in his face. He wasn't expecting her to look so composed, so unshaken. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. The group laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed in the empty street. "Oh, we'll leave you alone," one of them said, his tone laced with menace. "But not before we teach you a little respect." Monica took a deep breath, her mind racing through her options. She knew she could take them. Her years of training had prepared her for moments like this. But she also knew the importance of timing. They were underestimating her, mistaking her calm demeanor for weakness. That was their first mistake. Before she could act, the man closest to her lunged forward, his hand reaching for her arm. In one fluid motion, Monica sidestepped, grabbing his wrist and twisting it with calculated precision. He cried out in pain, stumbling backward as his friends froze in shock. "Big mistake," she said, her voice cold and sharp. The air seemed to shift, the confidence of the group faltering as they realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary woman. But Monica wasn't done. She knew they wouldn't back down easily, and she was prepared for what was coming next. What she didn't know was just how far they were willing to go, and how much she would have to reveal about herself to stop them. The night was far from over, and Monica was about to show them exactly who they had underestimated. And just as the tension reached its breaking point, a shadow moved in the distance, unnoticed by everyone. Someone else was watching, waiting, and ready to intervene if things spiraled out of control. But were they friend or foe? The answer would change everything. The street was eerily quiet, save for the heavy breathing of the man now clutching his wrist in pain. His friends stood frozen for a moment, their bravado cracking under the weight of Monica's calm yet commanding presence. The man she had disarmed stumbled backward, glaring at her, his anger bubbling over into rage. "You're going to regret that," he spat, his voice trembling. Monica didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her stance unassuming but poised. She wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had found her. She could feel the tension radiating off the group as they exchanged uncertain glances. Their confidence had been built on numbers, on the assumption that she would be an easy target. Now, they weren't so sure. "Walk away," Monica said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Her tone wasn't threatening, but there was no mistaking the warning behind her words. She knew they wouldn't listen. Men like this never listened until they were forced to. One of the others, taller and broader than the rest, stepped forward, trying to reassert their dominance. "You think you're tough," he growled, his hands curling into fists. "You don't know who you're messing with." Monica's eyes locked onto his, her gaze steady and unyielding. "No," she replied, her tone cool. "You don't know who you're messing with." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. For a brief moment the man hesitated, as though he could sense the danger lurking beneath her calm exterior. But pride was a powerful thing, and it pushed him forward. He gestured to the others, signaling them to close in. Monica braced herself, her mind racing through every possible scenario. She had been in high-stakes situations before, hostage negotiations, raids, even life-or-death confrontations, but this felt different. She wasn't wearing her badge tonight. She wasn't surrounded by her team. She was alone, and these men had no idea how close they were to making the worst mistake of their lives. As they moved toward her, she subtly shifted her stance, preparing to defend herself if necessary. But just as the tension reached its peak, a sound broke through the charged atmosphere, a low whistle, sharp and deliberate. The group froze, turning toward the source of the noise. In the shadows, a figure emerged, their face obscured by the dim light. They moved with a quiet confidence that immediately commanded attention. Monica's eyes narrowed as she assessed the newcomer. Friend or foe? The question burned in her mind, but she couldn't afford to take her focus off the immediate threat. The man in the lead turned to face the figure, his bravado slipping into irritation. "Who the hell are you?" he barked. The figure stepped closer, their features gradually coming into view. It was a man tall and lean, with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. His hands were tucked casually into the pockets of his jacket, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hinted at something far more dangerous beneath the surface. "Just a passerby," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "Seems like you're bothering someone who doesn't want to be bothered." The leader of the group sneered, his irritation quickly turning to anger. "This doesn't concern you. Mind your own business." The newcomer tilted his head slightly, his gaze flicking briefly to Monica, before returning to the group. "That's where you're wrong," he said evenly. "It became my business the moment you decided to gain up on her." Monica watched the exchange closely, her instincts on high alert. Whoever this man was, he wasn't backing down, and that only seemed to agitate the group further. She wasn't sure if he was here to help, or if he had his own agenda. But one thing was clear, his presence was shifting the dynamic. The group leader took a step toward him, his chest puffed out in a display of intimidation. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he sneered. "Why don't you turn around and walk away before you get yourself hurt?" The man didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. His calm demeanor was unnerving, a stark contrast to the group's growing aggression. "I could say the same to you," he replied, his voice steady. "But I have a feeling you're not the type to listen to reason." Monica's pulse quickened as she watched the standoff. She didn't know who this man was, but his confidence was undeniable. It was the kind of confidence that came from experience, from knowing exactly what you were capable of. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the promise of violence. Monica's mind raced, weighing her options. She could step in, try to de-escalate the situation, but something told her this man didn't need her help. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. The group leaders seemed to sense it too. His bravado faltered for a moment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You've got a big mouth," he said, his tone laced with hostility. "Let's see if you can back it up." The man didn't respond. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. It was a silent challenge, one that made the group leader's fists clench with frustration. Monica's gaze flicked between them, her heart pounding. She didn't know how this would play out, but one thing was certain: this was far from over. And as the shadows stretched around them, she couldn't shake the feeling that this night was about to take a turn no one could predict. The leader of the group, a man who had clearly built his reputation on intimidation, finally lost the thin grip he had on his temper. With a snarl, he lunged at the newcomer, his fists swinging wildly. The man sidestepped effortlessly, his movements fluid and calculated. Monica's eyes widened slightly. Whoever this stranger was, he wasn't just confident, he was skilled. The gang hesitated for a fraction of a second, their leader stumbling forward and catching himself before turning back, his face red with anger and humiliation. "You think you're funny, huh?" he growled, his voice shaking. "Boys, let's teach this clown a lesson." The group closed in, their movements less certain now, but still dangerous in their numbers. Monica could see the shift in their energy. They were used to winning by sheer force, by overwhelming their targets before they had a chance to react. But tonight was different, and they were starting to realize it. The man, still calm, raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but as if to indicate he was ready. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low but clear. "You don't want to do this." The leader barked a laugh, though it sounded forced. "Oh, we do. Trust me." Monica's instincts screamed at her to intervene, but she held back, her sharp eyes watching every move. She wasn't sure who this man was or why he had stepped in, but he clearly knew what he was doing. Her training told her that sometimes the best action was to wait, to let the situation unfold until the right moment presented itself. But she stayed ready, her muscles coiled like a spring. The first man lunged again, followed closely by another. The stranger moved like water, sidestepping one and bucking the other with a swift, precise motion. In seconds, both attackers were on the ground, groaning in pain. The rest of the group froze, uncertainty and fear flickering across their faces. Monica saw her opening. She stepped forward, her voice sharp and commanding. "Enough," she barked, her tone cutting through the tension like a knife. The men turned to her, startled by the sudden authority in her voice. "You've already embarrassed yourselves enough for one night. Walk away while you still can." The leader glared at her, his jaw clenched tight. "You think you're going to talk your way out of this?" He spat, though his bravado was clearly wavering. "No," Monica replied, her voice steady. "But I'm giving you a choice. Leave now, or you'll regret staying." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken promise. The leader looked at her, then at the man, then back at his fallen comrades. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But pride was a stubborn thing, and it drove him forward once again. "You think you're tough because you got lucky," he hissed, his anger boiling over. "We'll see how tough you are when." A sudden sound interrupted him. A sharp, authoritative voice calling out from the shadows. "Freeze. Hands where we can see them." Monica's heart skipped a beat as two figures stepped into the light, their uniforms unmistakable. Police officers, their hands resting on their holstered weapons, their expressions serious. Monica didn't know whether to feel relief or concern. She wasn't worried about herself, but how these officers would interpret the situation was another matter entirely. The group of men froze, their bravado crumbling as they raised their hands reluctantly. The leader's face twisted in frustration, but even he wasn't foolish enough to argue with the police. The officers approached cautiously, their eyes scanning the scene. "What's going on here?" One of them asked, his tone sharp. His gaze landed on Monica, then shifted to the man standing beside her. Before Monica could respond, the stranger spoke up. "These men were harassing her," he said calmly, nodding toward Monica. "I stepped in to help." The officer looked between them, his expression unreadable. "Is that true?" he asked Monica, his tone softening slightly. "Yes," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "They followed me, surrounded me." He stepped in when things escalated. The officer nodded slowly, his partner already moving to question the men. Monica watched carefully, her mind still racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that this night had set something in motion that wouldn't be easily resolved. As the officers began to take statements, Monica glanced at the stranger, her curiosity finally outweighing her caution. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. He turned to her, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Just someone who doesn't like bullies," he replied. His tone was light, but there was a weight behind his words, a hint of something deeper. Monica wasn't convinced. There was more to him than he was letting on, and she intended to find out what. But before she could press further, one of the officers called out to her, pulling her attention away. "We'll need you to come down to the station and give a full statement," he said, his tone apologetic, just routine. Monica nodded, her professional instincts kicking in. "Of course," she replied. As the officers began escorting the men toward their squad car, Monica turned back to the stranger. But he was already walking away, his figure disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. "Wait," she called after him, but he didn't stop. Monica stood there for a moment, watching him go, her mind swirling with questions. Who was he? Why had he stepped in? And what was he hiding? The night wasn't over, not by a long shot. Monica stood still for a long moment, staring at the shadows where the man had disappeared, her thoughts running wild. She had never been one to chase after a mystery. Her job in the FBI was to deal with facts, evidence, and clear-cut situations. But something about tonight felt different. The man had shown up at the exact moment she needed him, and the way he handled himself. It was like he was more than just a passerby, more than just a random act of heroism. Shaking her head, she turned back to the scene. The officers were wrapping up their questioning, the gang members now in handcuffs, their faces twisted in anger and confusion. The leader was especially vocal, yelling threats at the officers as they loaded him into the back of the police car. Monica caught a few of his words, but her mind was elsewhere, still on the stranger who had appeared and disappeared so quickly. She needed answers. The officers gave her a polite nod as they finished their paperwork. "You're free to go, ma'am. We've got everything we need." Monica nodded, but her mind wasn't on the paperwork. She wasn't about to let this strange encounter slip away. The man who had stepped in, he wasn't just some bystander. She could feel it in her bones. There was something calculated about him, like he knew exactly what he was doing when he intervened. But why? What did he want? As she walked toward her car, the question still spun in her mind. There had been something familiar about the way he moved, something unsettling about the calm in his eyes. It reminded her of the training she had received in the FBI's tactical unit, the same kind of discipline and self-control that was drilled into every agent. But this man wasn't an agent, at least not that she could tell. So where had he learned to fight like that? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She fished it out, glancing at the screen. It was an encrypted message from her supervisor, Agent Harris. "We need you in the office ASAP. Urgent." The message was short, to the point, and left no room for questions. Monica's stomach tightened as she read it. Whatever was going on, it couldn't be good. She didn't hesitate. Her car's engine roared to life as she sped down the street, her thoughts racing. The office was only a few miles away, but every minute felt like an eternity. The message had come just after the incident with the gang. Was there a connection? Was someone trying to send her a message? The traffic was light, and she made it to the FBI headquarters in record time. She parked in the secure lot, her boots clicking sharply as she strode toward the building. Her mind never stopped, analyzing every possible angle. She had a feeling her night was far from over, and whatever awaited her in that office, it was going to change everything. Inside the building, the usual hum of activity filled the air. Agents moved swiftly through the halls, their conversations low and urgent. Monica barely noticed any of it as she made her way to her supervisor's office. Agent Harris was waiting for her, his expression grim. "Sit down, Monica," he said without looking up from his papers. He didn't need to tell her twice. She sat, her posture tense, her mind already racing through every possibility. We've got a situation, Harris began, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of concern. Something's happening, and we need you on it. Monica's eyebrows furrowed. What kind of situation? Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. We've received intel. There's a rising threat in the city. A new gang, but not just any gang. These people, whoever they are, they've been targeting high-profile individuals, anyone with power. But here's the kicker. There's a pattern. A connection. Monica's pulse quickened. What kind of connection? Harris slid a folder across the desk toward her. You'll want to look at this. Monica opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents quickly. What she saw made her stomach drop. The new gang wasn't just targeting anyone. They were connected to a series of high-profile incidents, robberies, assaults, and even murders. But there was one name that kept coming up again and again. The man from the alley. Monica's heart skipped a beat. This can't be right, she muttered. That guy, he's part of this? Harris nodded grimly. We don't have all the details yet, but it looks like it. He's been linked to multiple incidents, all involving high-stakes operations. And the connections run deeper than we thought. We need you to dig into it. Monica's mind raced. The man who had saved her from the gang was somehow involved in something much darker. But why would he help her? Only to be connected to the very threats she was investigating. What was his real motive? Where do I start? She asked, her voice low, steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Harris stood and walked to the window, his back to her. We've got a few leads. First, we think he's connected to a larger network. A group of mercenaries, highly skilled, highly dangerous. They've been moving in and out of the city, and we believe they're setting up something big. Something that could shake the foundation of this whole operation. Monica absorbed the information quickly, her mind already working through the logistics. This wasn't just about a random encounter anymore. This was bigger than she could have imagined. And you want me to go after him? She asked, her voice sharper now. Harris turned to face her, his expression serious. I want you to find out everything you can. He's got answers, Monica. Answers that could prevent a whole lot of damage. But be careful. We don't know whose side he's really on. Monica nodded, already standing. I'll do what I can. As she left the office, the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. The man was no longer just a mystery. He was the key to something much more dangerous. And whatever game he was playing, Monica was about to find herself deep in the middle of it. Her phone buzzed again. Another encrypted message, this time from an unknown number. You're getting too close, agent. Stay out of it if you know what's good for you. Monica's grip tightened around the phone, her heart pounding. This was no longer just about a random gang or a strange encounter. It was a warning, and whoever was behind it was watching her every move. The tension was building, and Monica knew that when the storm finally hit, it would hit hard.